The Jetsons Charlton, issue 18. Sadly, it starts out with George saying he's gonna fix his car and somehow being wrong that trying to tighten it won't loosen it. It falls apart and he puts it back together, and it's stated that there's always a mess when George fixes something. Some plans to fix the car. George drives around in it with Jane apologizing to him for not having faith in him. And the story's already over after wasting most of its pages on content I wish never existed, that's really just a rehash anyways. In the next story, Spacely trusts George to deliver something without opening it. I guess George already started opening it by the time he was told not to. He releases the cat and it runs off and gets petted by his secretary. And George catches her and the cat with a butterfly net that I have to assume was in the office just in case George would let the cat out. The cat ends up back in the container and predictably belongs to Spacely's wife. George is told to take the new cat to the vet, but he finds out the animal hospital's closed. Why did he go there instead of a vet's office? George says he hates cats and wishes they were all in zoos, and the cat jumps out of the bag, making me wonder what took it so long if it could always do that. And despite being his wife, all Jane cares about when she sees him land the car all scratched up is the cat being cute. Somehow she doesn't even care about the car. Astro gets mad at the cat for it being on his pillow, and more panels are wasted until eventually Rosie says the cat's gone. And it only disappeared because it ignored an earlier story in the comic where Astro did chase a cat, and George had to chase it for him. George thinks he'll get fired the next morning for losing the cat. Spacely says he always wanted to get rid of the cat, and didn't want to do it himself. In the next story, George gets mad at Astro for being in his chair, and Astro somehow stays in a good mood, and looks over his shoulder as he reads the newspaper. Eventually, Astro reads the financial page, and George considers buying the stock his dog likes, just because of that, when clearly he's smarter than a dog. Somehow, Astro doesn't want dog food, and Rosie tells him he can go hungry. Astro takes a steak out of the fridge, while Rosie thinks George should get rid of him. And Astro glares at her, and she somehow says she was only joking because she instantly assumed he read her thoughts. This is an interesting mystery story. George tells Jane that Mr. Cogswell decided to manufacture a new set of gears, and then he says the Venetians beat us to it. Which implies that in this universe he's actually working for Cogswell because he said us. He says this is the only copy of the gear design the Venetians used, and he's the only person who saw it. He says he knows Astro isn't the spy, and considers putting on his slippers because his feet hurt. Astro brings him his slippers and turns off the boss's cartoons to switch to a channel where someone says scientists are going to discuss the most recent developments in chemistry and engineering. Rosie notices he seems to understand them and tells George to look at Astro watching a mathematician. George wonders if he's really Astro, and plans on giving him a good kick to see what he does. Astro looks at him and gets accused of not being Astro because he read his mind. But that doesn't necessarily mean he's not Astro. It could be that something happened to Astro to make him like this. A diabolical sex machina happens as the fake Astro brainwashes him and the family into becoming his slaves so he could go on spying for his Jupiter associates. And I wonder why he didn't do this much earlier. He plans to hypnotize Rosie as well, and I have to assume that her not being right next to all of them is why he didn't hypnotize her right away. And instead she had the time to smack him with a broom, having somehow read his mind. As I wonder why he thought he could brainwash Rosie as well as the people with biological brains. She calls him a robot with no proof. Even though he said he was from Jupiter, he could have just been alien. She's so strong she can smash the robot to pieces with a broom, and the real Astro comes into the room. I wish it was explained why Astro came back so quickly, because if he was always in the other room, he would have gone into the room with fake Astro in front of the family before this. In the next story, Rosie's annoyed at how messy the kitchen is and calls George and Elroy slobs. Astro bites her just out of spite. She may not have done anything wrong in this story, but I'm so glad it happened because she's usually a Karma Houdini who barely gets any slapstick. It's realistic that Astro's mouth hurts. Rosie talks in a sexist way, and Jane nags George and Elroy out of the living room. They somehow decided standing outside in the cold winter was a good idea when all they told them was to get out of here, which just meant the living room. It's obviously abusive of Jane and Rosie to put them through this. Jane, without an ounce of regrets, tells them to come back in where they track Snow into the house, which they must have done on purpose, and I can't blame them for wanting to get back at them now. Conveniently, somehow Rosie says she likes it this way, when she hated them for being slobs before. In the next story, George tells Rosie she's spilling stuff all over the kitchen floor, and Jane tells him to stop picking on her because she's nervous. Somehow, Elroy thinks robots can't get nervous, even though Rosie always talked like a human. Why would Jane think she'd be nervous here? That's out of character, unless she's breaking down again. I find it disturbing that the emphasized words are underlined instead of put in bold like they're supposed to in comics. It seems unprofessional of it. George suggests sending her back to the factory if she can't do her job, and she spills soup on him. And Jane victim blames him. Though it might have been his fault, but she did it! He threatens her, and Jane somehow smiles while telling him to stop it because Rosie's crying. George gets told to take Rosie to a psychiatrist. Somehow, the psychiatrist thinks it's George who needs to be analyzed, without knowing him at all, when it's obvious the shaking robot is his target. And he hurts his rib somehow. So this is a cliche cringeworthy scene about disgracing the whole profession of psychiatrists completely unprovoked. None of these panels are worth reading. There's no way to have his job. He tells him to get Rosie away from him because she's upsetting him. I don't have to tell you this would never happen either, do I? So his scene was all for nothing to justify George saying he has to send Rosie away with her grabbing the controls of the car. Then without any hint that George got bothered by a traffic cop, thankfully, they get home, and Jane says part of Rosie's control circuit wasn't working, and Elroy has a control panel on her back open. It's finally taking advantage of Elroy being good with gadgets in the show. But obviously a real robot psychiatrist would have found this out. She stops shaking because of him, and brings Elroy and Jane cake and ice cream, but tells George to get his own as karma for all the things he said about her. The Jetsons, Charlton, issue 19. George drives through space surrounded by signs telling him how far away Jupiter and Earth are, which I guess are only there to warn people not to bother heading for them if they're low on gas. Elroy warns him to be careful, and George ruins the story's potential for being good by not believing in some for no reason. Minor things like that can ruin a story if the story is too short. There's a big crunch noise and the car gets affected. Elroy lifts the air dome to get out, and he says there's an invisible planet here. If the writer knows it's ridiculous, why is he writing it anyways? It'd be nice if he cared enough to explain that a witch made this place the way it is, complete with invisible people who take offense to not being believed in. The Jetsons was always at least a little grounded in reality. I don't think this would ever happen in the show. George apologizes, and conveniently he gets offered glasses to see everything around him. Jane looks good in glasses, but he doesn't. Fortunately, someone offers to fix the spaceship while Jane's flattered by the flirtatious look he's giving her. So she's a hypocrite to George. George tells her to not dare see the sights with him, and she conveniently stays with the spaceship, when she usually doesn't listen to him. A lady hopes George is gonna stick around flirting with him, and Jane acts jealous because she's a selfish hypocrite who can't take what she just put George through, when she could have rejected the person flirting with her right away instead. She has the right to get mad, but it'd be nice if she showed some self-awareness. He somehow happily tells his wife that another woman invited the two of them to dinner, as if he forgot what Jane was like. Since both of them can show interest in other people than each other, I can understand them being jealous. But they're so wrong to think they'd actually be cheated on because it hasn't happened yet, and it's a cartoon for kids, which is the real reason I know would never happen. With George being guaranteed not to cheat, it'd be smarter of Jane to agree to the free dinner, not remove his glasses. It looks like the person complaining that he won't be able to find the planet ever again is Judy, because that's who the text bubble is connected to. But it's gotta be George. Elroy says Sam knows where the planet is, and Jane tells him if he or that Martian monster say a word, she'll punish them both. I'm glad she knows Sam exists, but it's racist of her to call him that. And Judy shouldn't be smiling because of it. The pinup has me wondering how Rosie rusts from walking in the rain, and why she'd do that for any reason. In the next story, Astro watches a TV show starring a dog with a jacket and looks up to him. Then he gets hit by a flash of light, censoring the impact George gave him for not staying out of his chair like he was told to. While it was abusive, Astro should have heard George coming up to him and smelled him and long since gotten out of the chair. But George should have just gotten a second chair. Astro admires the badly talking dog for not wanting to be a pushover anymore. Too many panels are wasted until I finally get to see him start taking revenge on George. He's a guest in their home, obligated to behave. He hates that George orders him to get his slippers because he didn't say please, and eventually he's insulted into growling at him. When he finds out George is scared of him for that, like anyone would be, he chases him, and Jane's got no reason to say George is just being silly asking for help because Astro wouldn't hurt a fly. He bites him constantly. She's just making an excuse not to help because she's resentful of his stupidity. And somehow Jane wastes time saying with a smile that Astro loves the TV show when she goes right to tell him to get off that chair. Somehow he does so instead of growling at her next when she just acted the same way George did before. Obviously respects her more than him because she's not as much of an idiot and she doesn't hurt him. I wish that was explained. It's satisfying that we finally see her say, "And stop biting my husband, do you understand?" It's also satisfying to see him say, "And don't ever try that again, Astro." Because usually he doesn't get to stand up for himself against him with everyone on his side. Astro cries and he can't stand it, and somehow he figured out he was crying because his show wasn't on, not because Jane just yelled at him. In the next story, George complains that he should replace Rosie because dinner was burned and the kitchen's full of broken plates and spilled liquids, when he could just send her to the robot doctor. She somehow says she's doing the best she can when she clearly isn't. Elroy's got a good reason to say something's happening to Rosie because this isn't usually the best she can do. Why is he smiling? He's supposed to have empathy. She screeches and Sam gets asked what's wrong with her. He says when a robot acts that way on Mars, it's having a nervous breakdown. I wonder why a 70s Jetsons comic was allowed to say those words, while IDW Sonic never did. Because I don't see why it being an old comic explains it. Rosie says she wants to quit being a maid, and then plans to spray George and use a kitchen utensil on him to keep him from putting her down again. A justified reason to freak out. Sam goes behind her and turns off her master switch. He uses a wrench on the side of her head to open it, and opens a control panel on her back to use a screwdriver in it. He closes her up and turns her back on. She ends up doing a great job, and I'm proud of her with her bowing and asking how's that. Although I should really be proud of Sam. George complains about the loud noise in here and is still naturally in a bad mood from the kitchen being messy before. So he condescendingly tells her to keep it clean from now on when he'd know she's going to anyways because it's her job. She's mad enough to say he makes her sick and shoot lightning at him for being rude. She takes the risk of telling him that's just for starters instead of leaving it at that, so she makes him absolutely guaranteed to plan on calling the robot replacement depot in the morning. I guess it's closed now. She has to be acting like this because some messed with her mind. She couldn't even mistreat him because of Code Red in the show. I wonder if she read his mind, but she didn't have to know he was planning on doing that. As I think Sam's not exactly a saint, but I can understand why. Rosie tells George to pick that paper up and expects him to do things her way around here from now on. He agrees, being scared, and I think that this won't make his life any different. Just because he can't get away with being rude to her as usual, he plans to call the cops. She's just mad with power because she can throw lightning at him, which must have been low enough in voltage to justify him not getting injured. Somehow he's surprised she heard him. She brags that she's got super good hearing and can see through walls, a power Sam had no reason to give her. He could at least explain that he was doing it in case a burglar broke into the house. Jean offers to talk this over with Rosie while George sits down. She tells her to slow down, and Elroy calls Sam out a little. Finally, Jean sympathizes with George, and Rosie says she can't slow down because she feels too good. She has no reason to run through a wall and fly. Sam modified her to know she had those powers right away, of course, and one of those powers was flight. Why did he give her flight? I guess he assumed she'd be responsible enough to only fly around for fun after her work is done. Or he wanted them to save money on gas. Conveniently, she goes back into the house, but somehow does it by bursting through the wall again. I guess she didn't mind damaging the walls because she hates George, and she doesn't have to pay for it, and she knows she can get away with anything. Sam says she'll be returned to normal, and she plans to make George's favorite food, which is sweet. I didn't think she'd want to make it up to him. The story ends with him still realistically scared of her. In the next story, George is nervous and thinks Judy's boyfriend is a creep because he's a weird-looking alien. Thankfully, Jonathan's polite enough not to flip out at him for his response to him. Judy knows to put more plates of food on the table than normal. Why does George think he can get away with telling him he's unusual? Jonathan's studying the Earthlings for being weird. George has got every right to be offended. He's a big eater who duplicates himself, which happens every 10 years. Judy's got no reason to think two of him are even good. It'd have been interesting that he thinks Earthlings are weird if he told him why to develop on his own people. Instead, the story ends without us ever finding out why Judy's in love with him. In the next story, Jane tells George not to eat cheese late in the day because it always gives him nightmares. That makes no sense. If it's true, he's got no excuse. It makes it too obvious what the plot's gonna be about. But I'd much rather have a plot that's all just a dream be honest from the start. George is fine with Astro being affectionate and falls asleep. Fred chases a tiger who goes through the TV. There's no reason for that to happen, so George had better be right that it's a dream. He runs and gets up on a nightstand. Rosie sees him and doesn't know what a tiger is. It took me a few seconds to figure out why. It's because she's so new to the world and spends most of her time being a maid. Somehow the tiger has human thoughts, so maybe it's an alien. It did come from the Flintstones world. She hits him with a broom to be useful. I love Rosie when she's being useful, especially when she's a badass. I do always look forward to her dialogue in the show. The next morning, George says he had a nightmare last night, but Astro confirms that it was real because he still has an injury. So there really was no excuse for the tiger going through the TV. I have to assume some made the TV three-dimensional out of spite again, but that needed to be explained. The Jetsons, Charlton, issue 20. George complains about Rosie because she pours coffee in the wrong place when trying to pour it for him. She says she's been hearing a lot of noises around the kitchen lately. He tells her to concentrate on her housework more so she won't hear them, even though he knows she would. She really should have concentrated more and avoided doing that to him. Just because there's noise doesn't mean that makes sense. Any other person wouldn't have made that mistake. She says when she's doing housework, that's when she hears them, and they keep faintly buzzing her antenna and they're annoying. So her antenna are ears. He opens her back panel and confidently adjusts her sensors thinking he could help her, and she thanks him with total faith in him. So that's nice. He'd have to be especially smart to do this well, and he's supposed to be good with technology. She says she just had her 1,000-mile checkup the other day and was marked as healthy. So there really is a 1,000-mile checkup for robots in her world, and it wasn't just an excuse. George complains about the bills he has to pay, and she insists on being offended when she should sympathize instead. He says he's gonna go bowling because apparently he doesn't hate it anymore thanks to his friends off-screen teaching him to get better. Rosie hears the toaster and iron making puns, wasting too many panels on nothing happening. And she tells George. Thankfully, his only reaction is to recognize that it's his fault and turn the sensor adjustment knob, rather than accusing her of needing the robot doctor. She thanks him, and sadly the story's ending sucks because she still has this problem somehow. In the next story, Jane wakes up George because he's too tired from working into the early hours of the morning on a project he dreamed up. Some robot hands take care of him in the bathroom, putting his shoes on and brushing his teeth and putting his shirt on. He leaves because he's late for work, returns to kiss her and comes back because he forgot his briefcase. But this bores me because it's just gonna repeat a joke from an earlier comic. He comes back because he's airsick. Later he crawls under Spacely's desk and Spacely abusively kicks him. And he tells Spacely why he's been tired. He shows him his idea for a plastic air-supported building as high as 12 stories and at low-cost construction. Spacely likes the idea. Somehow George left the blueprints at home, and he's told to go home where somehow he finds out Astro tore them up, even though he has human intelligence. George abusively kicks him and tells Spacely over the phone that he has to do the drawings again, when it's obvious he could tape the big pieces back together. He's told to do them again the next night where he falls asleep. Elroy's still awake and heads over to him. He'd only still be awake if he uncharacteristically cared that much about him that he wanted to check on him to help him if he was asleep. Usually he only seems to care about himself. Once again he shows off his genius from the show by knowing what the blueprints are about and does some scribbling. Jane tells George that Elroy finished the blueprints for him. And George takes them despite having no faith in him for no reason because he has to show Spacely something. He'd know Elroy's a genius. He knows in the show. I wonder if Spacely will hate the blueprints, despite the fact that Elroy's supposed to be a genius, just because he's a kid. Spacely sees the paper and somehow thinks of George as his most able employee who should be put in charge of this because of his one good idea. You'd think a jerk like him would be cynical, not believe he could completely change. George says he deserves the bonus and threatens to get Astro to tear up the blueprints otherwise. Well, Spacely is a jerk. I can see where Elroy got his intelligence from. Spacely humors him, and I wonder if he'll change his mind, as George tempts fate by telling Jane before he announces his bonus. Well, usually I think of George as an idiot, but he is very talented in terms of fixing things and apparently dreaming up this idea. So that's the intelligence he gave Elroy. It's nice to see the two hugging. While I don't feel like Jane deserves to get to waste his hard-earned money on shopping in this comic, it's still unexpectedly compassionate of him to tell her she can do that with his bonus. I think it's stupid though. Spacely tries to introduce George to people, but he's not there yet, and he gets mad at him for being late. I'm not really sure why he's able to be late, considering that in the show, he has a 1-hour workday, and it starts pretty late in the day. Spacely says he can't fire him right after handing out a press release telling people he promoted him. Spacely's promoting him to Vice President of Planning More Profitable Projects before he's even found out for sure that his air-supported buildings are going to make him rich. George really does win the Architectural Award of the Year, though it's sadly off-screen for no reason. I wonder if this is a dream of his. He thanks Spacely for letting him move into the new building before the dedication. George wonders where to hang his award, hits the wall with a hammer, and ruins the building. He would have been told not to. Why didn't the person make the building better? And just because he made this mistake doesn't mean he should lose his job of planning more profitable projects. Because he could still plan profitable projects. The story ends with basically breaking the laws of physics because he's so mad because apparently he discovered he was a warlock in this universe just because he got angry. Then there's a page where Jane somehow trusts George to help her with her checkbook to find the mistake. So why didn't she go to him for help last time? It must be a different universe. He thinks her math is off, as if there's no calculators in the future. And Elroy says the only thing that'll help Jane's checkbook is a big deposit. In the next story, George gets mad at Rosie because she didn't have dinner ready yet, and she didn't put out his slippers and pipe we never see. Which I would think would be Astro's job. And Rosie stupidly calls it her kitchen. Out of nowhere, George is written to accuse women of being inefficient, making me assume the writer is planning to punish him for being sexist in the future. He's just trying to feel better after a hard day at work and Rosie's belligerence. It doesn't matter what he said. It still wasn't right for Jane and Rosie to throw shoes and newspapers at him. It definitely wasn't justified for Jane to throw a newspaper at Elroy when Elroy didn't do anything. He's only abused for being a boy. So the women are being as sexist as the men. Even worse, because George didn't hurt anyone. All of the women in the family and Rosie start immaturely picketing outside of the apartments building on the surface as we finally see there's a lawn and road there in the Charlton comic. I like that because it makes sense. It's not as dark as it being unlivable under there. What they should be doing is trying to prove they aren't inefficient. There's nothing efficient about them wasting time doing this. Astro's holding an equal rights sign up with his tail. I guess he got bribed into it with dog food. It's stupid though because George has hit him before. So why do you provoke George? George shames him, lampshading him being on their side. Astro doesn't explain himself with a thought bubble. And George somehow says to Elroy that he's gonna clean up the house. And says they can do the men's jobs around here. Jane says she's won. She'd only think that if she underestimates his job. Or thinks he has nothing to do. Somehow, both George and Elroy are smiling while George is telling Rosie to take out the trash, while he and Elroy do the dishes by hand in the future. At least explain that the dishwasher is broken, but we've seen robot hands cleaning the dishes in an earlier issue. So I guess that was broken too. He tells Rosie to tell Jane to walk the dog, and have the sales report ready to take to the office in the morning. I want to see that! And how's the sales report housework? That's not really fair. Astro dusts with his tail as George says there's nothing hard about cleaning the house. And Astro makes him look bad by making something fall and break. It'd be an overdone cliche to have all of the men suck at cleaning the house, but so far it looks like they're subverting it. George says they're gonna go have a picnic. And holds an umbrella while telling Jane, who's carrying the basket, not to forget the fishing poles. She's exhausted by the weight of the basket and coughs covered in soot because she had to make the bonfire. This is satisfying. Jane never gets any karma. It feels like it's written by two different writers, one that's a current generation feminist and one that's not. She forces herself to smile and looks forward to getting to fish while he tidies up. She screams at seeing the worm, which maybe she wouldn't have had as much of a problem with if she had the foresight to wear gloves. And the story ends with everything back to normal with everyone happy about it. In the next story, Jane doesn't approve of the fact that every time George hears a rattle in his car, he buys a new one, when he's the one paying the bill, so he probably is right that he can afford it because he knows how much he has. If he can afford it, she's just being irrational by objecting to his good idea because she gets used to the old car. Usually George complains about the bills. So either this is why, or this is a different universe where he's richer. George goes to someone to look for a new car, and gets told to take it for a trial drive. Jane doesn't look happy, and George says the girls in the family can't handle it because it's too powerful. I guess he thinks it's so fun to fly that's worth buying a car that he'll only be able to drive alone or without worrying the car. But I don't like that the story was kind of forced to get to this point. He refuses to let Judy drive it because she's not an expert driver. The story ends with him crashing into the garbage car. There's no apparent excuse for that because he'd see it coming, and it can drive in any direction. I have to assume this only happened to punish him for not letting Judy drive it. But it looks like he had every reason to try to keep it safe from an amateur. Maybe that's not why he was written to crash, and the writer somehow thought it'd be funny that a guy spent tons of money on a new car for nothing and got hurt in a car accident because of the most predictable joke possible. The first story had George suck at fixing his car when he's supposed to be good at it, and it only runs well because of a child fixing it. So that story sucked. Although it was nice that some did something nice without anything backfiring. The second story has George brings Spacely's cat home, where Astro scares it into running away. And that was what Spacely wanted all along. I guess he assumed George would fail at getting rid of the cat on purpose, so he didn't tell him to try to do that. But why did he do it so complicatedly? This has nothing to do with sci-fi at all. The third story was surprisingly interesting with the mystery going on about why the supposed Astro is acting smarter than usual and can read minds. It worked because Rosie's ongoing suspicion made it clear that it'd be explained later on. The fourth story has Rosie and Jane get mad at the men of the family for causing a mess and force them out of the living room to wait out in the freezing cold without winter clothes on, which they were somehow compliant in. So that story sucked. What did that have to do with sci-fi? The final story was shockingly depressing because the whole time the family thinks Rosie's shaking because she's become a nervous wreck and needs a psychiatrist. But after a completely unprovoked jab at psychiatrists, where there's a whole scene of one being impossibly worthless, and it's bad enough that it was in the show, Elroy fixes her. So instead of there being a plot hole because there was no reason for her to become so nervous, it made sense that she was shaking. The first story is interesting enough to make up for George not believing in some, because not only does Jane believe in him, but the family visits an invisible planet, which they can see because of special glasses that the natives conveniently carry at all times just in case because they love being helpful to aliens. The same reason one of them fixed their spaceship for free. I guess the aliens visit this place a lot. It's full of conveniences, so the conflict had to come from George and Jane's mutual jealousy. Which was annoying as nobody calls out Jane on the fact that she wasn't rejecting the person who flirted with her right away. It was so uncreative to have that be the only conflict. The second story is about George's kicking Astro, provoking him into growling at him the whole story, until Jane talks him into behaving again. The reason I like this plot, even though Astro had no excuse for misbehaving the first time, is that it's Astro instead of Rosie in response to outright physical abuse. And all he actually does is growl, when I expected variety to make it interesting. If it was Rosie, she's immune to physical abuse from him anyways, and has an obligation to be polite to her boss. The third story has some give Rosie superpowers because he didn't see why not when fixing her up, and his lack of responsibility and foresight, or lack of empathy if he did see this coming, is entirely to blame for zapping George like he deserves for being rude. Which still isn't in character for her. I don't know why it's not explained that he made her have superpowers in case burglars showed up, and he made her mean to George to spite him. It's too bad the rest of her powers, besides pointlessly flying, don't involve her doing anything. The rest of the story is just him wishing he could get rid of her until she's fixed. Like that's anything new. The fourth story is Judy bringing an alien boyfriend home who calls Earthlings weird. But it's interesting to see that he duplicates. I just didn't like the story because of what a jerk he was. The fifth story has a tiger jump through George's TV with no explanation since it wasn't a dream, or a 3D TV, so George has to outrun it, which he's luckily able to do, and jump onto a nightstand to tell Rosie to attack it. It was exciting, even if almost nothing got to happen. It could make sense because of some messing with the TV off screen. It really would make him evil. The first story has George's turning of a dial on Rosie cause her to hear voices in her head, which is just an excuse for the appliances to make puns. Nothing happens other than that. But I like how creative the story was. The second story is George tells basically his idea for a building after a bunch of padding caused by the consequences of him staying up late because of it. And the award he gets for it ends up causing him to ruin the building trying to put a nail in it to hang the award. He would have been told not to use nails on it if it even made sense for the building to be made that badly. And why was the building made that badly? All of that comic space, and it was all for nothing because presumably he got demoted. The third story was surprisingly satisfying, having Jane find out how hard George's life is at home when she starts doing his share of the housework. At first it seemed like it sucked. I thought it'd just be about over-punishing George for being forced by the writer to be sexist in the future, but thankfully the writer must have known Jane went too far by abusing Elroy for no reason. Because in a refreshing twist, Jane got all of the karma while George was fine with cleaning up. It felt realistic because, of course, Jane hated the work she had to do. It's got no real sci-fi at all, but seeing Jane get karma for a story is pretty nice in small doses. The final story is George buy a new car, and I have to assume the reason Jane doesn't like it when he drives it is motion sickness from him turning so much to have fun with the new car. It's out of character that he would buy a new car every time he got a little thing wrong with his car though. So this never would have happened. It should have been established that this is a different universe where he's rich. It's all for nothing because he somehow crashes it. It should have shown us why he crashed. I thought after this was a Harvey comic, but that's just a bunch of reprints of the Charlton comic. So what's really after this is the Archie Jetsons comic.